Welcome back to Intellectual Potluck, and for today's historical investigation, we are going to be looking at the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated on the 4th of April, so I'm going to be trying to release this episode around about that date. As has become the trend, I want to give some background on Martin Luther King's work, his activism, and then go into the assassination and a little bit of information around that. So we'll cover a bit of everything, and I'll include time codes in both the audio apps and on YouTube, so you can just skip to the bits that are most interesting to you. There is so much to cover from Martin Luther King's life. We would be here for days if I tried to cover all of it. The man was so busy and influenced so much, so I'm just going to give some of the highlights. I'm sure a lot of us already know some background on Martin Luther King, but just in case you don't, he was a civil rights activist in America who played a pivotal role in advancing civil rights for people of color, not just in America, but worldwide. So his early days were spent as a pastor in a church in Montgomery. And if Montgomery sounds familiar, that might be because you may know a bit about Rosa Parks, who was also in that area. So she was arrested for refusing to surrender her bus seat to a white person. And following her arrest was when Martin Luther King became involved in the activism in Montgomery. So he offered up the church basement to organise the bus boycott that they did, and he actually ended up taking quite a big leadership role in the bus boycott. Because of his relative newness to community leadership, they thought it might make it easier for him to speak out, and King was initially a bit hesitant to do it, but ultimately did do it. So this boycott took place between 1955 and 1956, and it consisted of asking all people of colour to not use the buses in protest to Rosa Parks' arrest. The conditions for them ending the protest were courteous treatment by bus operators, passengers being seated first come first serve, and also black people being able to be employed as bus operators on routes that were predominantly taken by people of colour. These conditions were pretty basic, and they were even open to a little bit of compromise in certain areas, but they felt that the city of Montgomery was more likely to accept these conditions if they were less extreme, rather than demanding like a full integration of the buses. But it was still too much for the people of Montgomery. They let the protest go on for a really long time. So this protest was actually very successful, and its impact was definitely felt by the community. Membership to the White Citizens Council doubled during the course of the boycott because of all of this pressure they were feeling. And despite the fact that this was a very peaceful protest, the council did not respond peacefully, very often resorting to violence. King and another one of the organisers, Abernathy, their houses were both firebombed, as were 4 Black Baptist churches. And a lot of the boycotters were physically attacked as well. And then Martin Luther King himself, he actually ended up spending 2 weeks in prison as a result of this protest. But this massively blew up in people's faces because all it did was bring national attention to the protest. And ultimately this protest resulted in a successful Supreme Court ruling that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. So massive win. And the other thing that it did, not only did it get King involved in activism, but it really got him out there as a leader. In the years that followed, he really continued on with that, spending a lot of time across America and even sometimes overseas, speaking out about the rights of people of colour. I'll link a full timeline below because, like I said, there were so many different things. But I'm going to move on to another one of his most famous moments. And of course, I am talking about the I Have a Dream speech. So he gave this speech in 1963 at a march that had been organised by other people, and it was to protest racial discrimination, support civil rights legislation, and many other things. And the support for this march was massive. There was people coming from all over, and it was also incredibly well publicised. So King delivers his speech, and the speech is 17 minutes long, so I am not about to recite the whole thing, and it would not be the same coming from me by any means. So I, again, will link it below so that if you do want to have a full read, you definitely can. But you might be familiar with one of the most famous quotes from it, which I'm going to read now. It's, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that all men are created equal." I think part of why this quote has gained such prominency is because it does feed into the Declaration of Independence, which is, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And it just really highlights that America weren't living by that. And as we all know, this speech has gone down as one of the best speeches in American history, if not in world history. After the march, King and some of the other civil rights activists were invited to meet the president at the time, who was John F. Kennedy, and also Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. So they were invited back to the White House, and they discussed the need for bipartisan support for civil rights legislation. And a lot of this is credited towards passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and also the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Both of these were huge political wins. The Civil Rights Act led to the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was there to address race and sex discrimination in employment, and the Community Relations Service to help communities solve racial disputes. And it also authorized federal intervention to ensure desegregation in schools, parks, swimming pools, and other public facilities. And the Voting Rights Act abolished the need for literary tests and poll taxes, which were designed to disenfranchise African American voters. And it also gave the federal government the authority to take over voter registration in counties with a pattern of prominent discrimination. So another thing that King was very, very passionate about was advocating for the rights of poor and disadvantaged Americans. And one of the big steps that he did to try and support this was the Poor People's March in 1968. So this was a march organized to demand economic and human rights for poor Americans of diverse backgrounds. And so they set up a 3,000-person camp on the Washington Mall, and they stayed there for 6 weeks. Unfortunately, this is one of King's less successful campaigns. The Johnson administration didn't do a whole lot as a result of it, most likely because of the Vietnam War, which was taking up a lot of their attention at the time. And this does become a massive point of contention between King and LBJ, so I will definitely be touching more on that later. But yeah, amazing thing, very cool march, not the most successful. So we've talked about a lot of the amazing things that Martin Luther King did, but as you can probably expect, despite receiving some support from politicians and being able to get some policies through, there were a lot of people who were actively working against King. And even if they weren't outright or outspokenly against him, there were a lot of people who were very fearful of the authority that he seemed to hold and a lot of the very new ideas that he was throwing out there. King actually ended up finding himself as one of the primary targets for the US counterintelligence program, which was an FBI operation aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, and discrediting and disrupting civil rights leaders and other activists. And it is said that King's growing opposition to the Vietnam War was a big part of why the FBI chose to target him specifically a lot. J. Edgar Hoover was the long-standing director of the FBI at the time, and he saw King as a dangerous radical and potential communist sympathizer, despite having absolutely no credible evidence to support this, and despite King being openly peaceful and not dangerous radical. But I suppose he had to find something to justify repeatedly bombarding King with different things. So the FBI obtained approval from the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, to wiretap Martin Luther King and some of his close associates, and this was back in 1963. These wiretaps captured a lot of details of King's personal life, and the FBI ended up using these to blackmail him. The FBI also tried to discredit him by leaking information to the press, and they even mailed him an anonymous letter in 1964 urging him to unalive himself to avoid public disgrace. So there was a lot of really, really shady things going on directed specifically at King. But then on top of this, they were also sending informants into civil rights organizations to try and spread discord and attempt to discredit King within these organizations as well, portraying him as corrupt and immoral. Hoover's animosity towards King lasted right the way through to the end of King's life and even beyond. He was repeatedly trying to downplay King's legacy and influence. As well as opposition from the FBI, of course, a civil rights group is going to have opposition from organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council, who were very, very opposed to a lot of King's work. And they really weren't shy about their aggressive tactics to try and stop him from doing his work. There were bombings, assassinations, and intimidation. These were all very common tactics that were used. King's home had been bombed during the 1956 Montgomery bus protests, as I mentioned. And there was also the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963. And then on top of this, there were a lot of politicians, particularly Southern politicians, such as the Alabama governor at the time, George Wallace, and the Mississippi Senator, James Eastland, who actively worked to maintain segregation and to discredit King. But even moderate politicians like President Lyndon B. Johnson, despite having worked with King on the civil rights legislation, they became very frustrated with King's criticism of the racism in the South. We also saw a lot of white moderates, including clergy and other public figures, who were urging King to slow down and try and take a more gradual approach to change, which wasn't what he wanted to do. They were starting to see movement, they were starting to see progress. He wasn't going to slow down just because people were telling him to. But needless to say, because of all of this, by the late 1960s, King's approval rating amongst Americans was low. Really low. His very vocal opposition to the Vietnam War only strengthened this, and his focus on economic justice alienated a lot of previous allies as well. So aside from within his own communities, he was facing a lot of backlash. But from what I can tell and from what I can understand, he didn't let it slow him down. He'd expected it all. He had the support of the people that he saw mattered and carried on with the work that he was doing, which everyone can now be grateful for. So now we will go on to the assassination itself and some of the aftermath. So on the evening of April 3rd in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered what would be his final speech. It was at the Mason Temple in Memphis. He'd come to Memphis originally to support the sanitation workers' strike, but his speech that night has become significant because it's kind of eerily, prophetic. I'll pull up a quote and you guys will see what I mean. So the bulk of the speech was calling for economic justice, nonviolent resistance, and unity among different labor movements, and unity among civil rights activists. But there was a really chilling moment near the end of the speech where King seemed to predict his own assassination, or at least that's how we view it now in hindsight. But he said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land. I may not get to be there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as people will get to the promised land." And this was in his final speech. It's eerie, for sure, looking back on it. And so the next day, April 4th, King was staying at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. He was on the balcony outside of his room and he was fatally shot. He was rushed to the hospital. Doctors attempted to save him, but the wound was too severe. And so at 39 years old, King was pronounced dead. And news of his assassination spread quickly and led very quickly to riots across over 100 cities in the US, including Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Baltimore. There are more. I'm not going to list over 100 cities. Many Black Americans saw King's assassination as proof that the country was unwilling to grant true racial justice. And there was so much anger built up from decades of segregation, police brutality, economic inequality, and political neglect. It all just erupted into violence. And President Johnson, he responded by ordering more than 50,000 National Guard troops and army soldiers into the cities. There were curfews introduced, mass arrests, and they were just trying to suppress the unrest. Ultimately, over 40 people were killed in these riots. Thousands were injured and more than 20,000 were arrested. And while the riots were met with military force, they did also put the pressure on the government to act on some of these civil rights legislations that they had been sitting on. So just 1 week after King's assassination, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is also known as the Fair Housing Act. And this law prohibited discrimination in housing based on race, religion, or national origin. And then on April 7th, so just 3 days after King's assassination, Johnson called for calm, basically begged for calm, but also declared a national day of mourning for King. So it did take a while for them to be able to catch the gunman, James Earl Ray. But on June 8th of 1968, Ray was arrested at London Heathrow trying to board a flight to Belgium. He was extradited to the US, where he'd pled guilty in 1969. I believe it's because it was plead guilty or you're up for the death penalty. So instead he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. But shortly after accepting this plea, or I think it was shortly after, but at some point after, He recanted his confession and claimed that he'd been coerced, so that he spent the rest of his life trying unsuccessfully to overturn his conviction. And this has led to a lot of different conspiracies around Martin Luther King's assassination. Many people believe the FBI and CIA or other government entities played a role, especially given the FBI's history of covert operations against King. Some people believe the assassination was just a continuation of these efforts. There was an investigation by Congress in 1979. A House Select Committee found that there was likely a conspiracy involved in King's assassination, but they did not directly implicate the US government. They strongly suggested that organized crime or white supremacist groups may have been involved, and the ultimate conclusion was that James Earl Ray fired the shot. There was a likelihood of conspiracy, but no US government agency was involved. But this all got thrown about when in 1993, I think it was, Lloyd Jowers publicly claimed that he had been part of the plot to kill Martin Luther King and that he'd received $100,000 from a Memphis businessman to facilitate the assassination. King's family then started a civil lawsuit against Jowers. I believe it was a wrongful death lawsuit. And the main reason that they did this was they just wanted an official ruling, even if it wasn't a criminal ruling, but an official ruling acknowledging that the assassination was part of a broader conspiracy, and also hoping that it would force the US government to declassify documents related to King's death. So in 1999, this all went to court, and after only 4 weeks of testimony and only 1 hour of deliberation, the jury unanimously ruled that there was a conspiracy to assassinate Martin Luther King. Lloyd Jowers and government agencies were involved. The US government and mainstream media have largely dismissed this ruling, maintaining that James Earl Ray acted alone. But this trial remains one of the most controversial and pivotal moments in the history of King's assassination, because whilst it did not result in criminal prosecutions, it reinforced those deep suspicions to a lot of people, including King's family, that there was a bigger conspiracy. But all of this is to say, I genuinely believe that the most important thing about Martin Luther King Jr. is the impact of his work. I think that this impact genuinely cannot be measured. Not only did he support cultural and legislative change throughout both his life and his death, but he also inspired so much more. Things like the Black Lives Matter movement of recent day, those can all stem from the works of King and other people like him. His ideas truly reshaped culture itself. And whilst I know I've talked about a lot of the legislative changes, because those are incredibly important, I think the cultural change is what really sticks with us. The I Have a Dream speech is such a defining moment in changing cultural attitudes towards race. And his work helped to dismantle the idea that segregation is just the way things are, and made equality a mainstream value for people. He also proved that peaceful protests could bring around massive social change. He was very much a non-violent protester, and yet he was able to gain so much impact. And his emphasis on peaceful protest and moral justice has influenced a lot of future social justice movements, including LGBTQI+ rights, feminism, and also even climate activism. His philosophy has inspired movements worldwide, especially when you consider other things that were going on in the world at the time, such as Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid work. During his 1994 address to Congress, Mandela actually quoted King's famous words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last," demonstrating the shared struggle that they had for freedom and equality. So in conclusion of all of this, I want to highlight the significance of his life. And although his assassination in 1968 was a devastating blow, it really reinforced the urgency of the civil rights movement and pushed forward things like the Fair Housing Act and inspired continued activism in so many people. The riots and national mourning following his assassination exposed some deep racial tensions in America. And they also sparked a period of reflection and change and recognition for civil rights issues. And King's family have worked tirelessly to preserve his legacy, fighting to establish Martin Luther King Day as a federal holiday and pushing further civil rights advancements. And, it's thanks to King and all of the people that have followed after him that his messages of peace, justice, and unity remain so relevant today. So I hope you've all enjoyed this episode. I've never really explored American history before, and I've really loved doing the research for this one. It's been so interesting and so inspiring. Everything that I've read has just been so powerful, and yeah, I loved it. It was really, really humbling reading about this topic, and I would actually strongly recommend that you all do as well, because there's so much to it, and yeah, it's incredible. But yeah, please let me know in the comments or on socials if there are any topics that you want me to cover. I love suggestions because I can be really indecisive. But yeah, that's it from me, and I hope everyone has an amazing day, night, whenever you're watching or listening to this. Bye.